Good evening. Could I get a good evening? Good evening. Thank you. To those joining us in person at the Forum at Columbia University and to those joining virtually to Zoom, to the 7th annual Lea K Green Artist Talk featuring artist Derek Fordjour and honoree interdisciplinary artist Sanford Biggers, we welcome you. My name is Dan Huff, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Studio Museum in Harlem. On behalf of the Public Programs team, including Melania Graham, Naomi Aminu-Fasea, Maya Whites, and the entire Studio Museum community, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Now, as the year winds to a close, the events calendar seems to be busier, and home seems that much cozier. I'm especially thrilled to welcome you, as this is our first in-person Lea K Green program since 2019. Yes. We are so grateful for the partnership of the Forum at Columbia University for hosting us today as we eagerly await the reopening of our museum home in Harlem. And it's worth noting that our last in-person Lea K Green Artist Talk took place right here. We thanks to No Captions for providing live captioning on Zoom, and Pro Bono ASL and DeafLink for ASL interpretation at the Forum. Before I hand things off, I'd like to offer some patches for you to stitch together over the course of tonight's conversation. From a 2019 interview of Sanford's when speaking about his experimental performance art band Moon Medicine, he says, "Our goal is to do the same thing I try to do in my art practice, to eradicate historical amnesia and stimulate thought." And to take it one step further, with some actual questions, in support of a Moon Medicine performance at the Phillips Collection in 2022, Sanford asked publics the following questions. How have you connected to the world over the last 2 years? What have you lost? What have you found? Where have you shared your abundance? Who or what would you like to thank? What are your wishes for the world? There will be time for a few questions to Sanford and Derek post-conversation, and in the spirit of equal opportunity in this hybrid world we now live in, we'll be taking questions from both the in-person audience as well as those joining us on Zoom. And now it's my great pleasure to invite our Director and Chief Curator, Thelma Golden, to offer welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayan. I want to thank Dayan and the entire Studio Museum in Harlem Public Programs team, events team, development team, curatorial team, all the teams that make everything we do possible. Good evening. I am so thrilled to be here with everyone in person, to be here for this evening, and we're grateful for all of you for joining us, and really appreciate your continued support and dedication to the museum in these continuing complex times. This program was created to honor a beloved member of the Studio Museum family, Lea K Green, who passed away in 2014. During her time at the Studio Museum as Director of Special Projects, Lea and I worked together in intense and interesting and inspiring ways. Lea was a friend who then became a colleague. She was my really first partner in the visioning for what the Studio Museum is and was becoming as I became director in 2005. What I loved about Lea is that she told me the truth every single day, whether I wanted it or not. But also what I loved is Lea was game for every idea I put on the table and was my best hype person ever. She encouraged, every moment of thinking that made it possible for us to do so much. I can remember being in a meeting when we were negotiating for our first publication with a major publisher, and we were at a table with like 15 people from this publishing company, and they said, okay, if we're gonna make this deal, you're gonna need to negotiate the rights and reproductions, you will have to engage the authors, you will need, a lawyer to do this, a rights person, and Lea just said yes, yes, yes through this whole meeting, knowing that every single thing they said was going to be her job, right? They named like 15 different things, and Lea was like, we've got that, and we did. And we did so much. So this talk honoring Lea is always a way for me to think about Lea, but I will say I think about her every day. I do, as I do our work. So this talk was created to uphold so many of the things that Lea held dear. Her deep desire, Lea was a lawyer, but she deeply, deeply loved and spent time with artists. Her desire always to be in this community in ways that were profound, and the ways in which she always thought about how the museum and its role could broaden and expand. So I want to thank tonight Derek Fordjour for agreeing to be in this conversation to moderate with Sanford Biggers. Derek's a phenomenal artist, and we are thrilled that his work is in our collection, but even more thrilled because this idea, when it came about, seemed so perfect as a way to engage. And then I want to thank Sanford for saying yes to this opportunity. Sanford and I got to know each other when he was an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in 1999. He was in the first class of artists in residence that I had the pleasure to work with, that included Nicole Awai and Terry Boddy. And from that time, his AIR show, he was included in my exhibition in 2001, Freestyle, and has continued through his practice to seamlessly work in a multimedia fashion, thinking broadly about ideas and history, and to do that in a number of ways that speak to a vocabulary that is poetic and profound. There's nothing that Sanford's work doesn't include, right? It touches the world. It's deeply international, but also really grounded in him and the ways in which he walks through the world. So I want to thank Sanford, not only for this evening, but for his work. I want to extend a very special thank you to the Green family, Connie Green, Lenny Green, and also to Vivian and Wesley. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you all here tonight. And I also want to extend my immense gratitude to all of those who have donated to the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund for the past 7 years. You have made this evening possible. And now to share about our tonight's speakers, I'd like to invite Lenny Green to the stage.
Thank you, Thelma. You know, on behalf of my family, I just want to say again how much this means to us as a collective, to us as a family, and how your leadership has really just inspired this to continue on. And it's special to be in year 7. So thank you, Thelma. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here on behalf of my family and the Lea K. Green Artist Talk series, which we've, as I said, continued into the 7th year now. I'm Lenny Green, and I'm here to tell you a little bit more about Derek and Sanford, and also talk a little bit about my sister, Lea. As Thelma said, Lea had a long professional and personal relationship with the Studio Museum here in Harlem. And so when we were thinking about how to honor her legacy after her passing, it was only natural that we wanted to partner with the Studio Museum. And under Thelma's leadership, we were able to evolve this fund into supporting this public program, the Lea K. Green Artist Talk. The Studio Museum was really like Lea's extended family, and her colleagues became not just friends, but family members. And my mother and I joke all the time that now you all are our family too, and we really mean that, because to be able to have Lea's name remembered and affiliated with this kind of work is just such a privilege and honor, and we're happy to be in the 7th year. Just to tell you a little bit more about the history of the Lea K. Green Artist Talk, as I said, we're in our 7th year now. Our inaugural talk was in 2016, where Carrie Mae Weems was our featured artist. In 2017, we were lucky enough to have Jordan Castile. 2018, we were followed with Amy Sherald. 2019, we featured Dawood Bey. 2020, we had Hank Willis Thomas, and then 2021, we were able to feature Vanessa German. So it's just been a true legacy here to have all of these amazingly generous artists spend time with us, spend time in this program, and to be affiliated with this event that is so special to our hearts. So I'm especially excited to introduce tonight's participants, Sanford and Derek. So just to tell you a little bit more about Derek, for those of you that don't know, he'll be moderating this talk. And he was born to parents of Ghanaian heritage. He's a graduate of Morehouse College and earned a master's degree in art education from Harvard University and an MFA in painting from Hunter College. In 2018, he was awarded commissions for the Whitney Museum of American Art Billboard Project and the MTA Arts and Design program. Recently, he was the inaugural artist for the Building Art series on the facade of Mocha Grand Avenue in Los Angeles. His work has been reviewed in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Hyperallergic. He has also been featured in several publications, such as the Wall Street Journal, Juxtapose, Vanity Fair, and Forbes. His work is held in the private and public collections of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Guggenheim Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Whitney Museum, and LACMA. Our honoree, Sanford Biggers, just to tell you a little bit more about his work and his honors, he has been awarded the Heinz Award for the Arts in 2021, the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in 2018, and the Rome Prize in Visual Arts in 2017. He has held solo exhibitions at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, the Museum of Art in Detroit, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Brooklyn Museum. He's also been involved in group exhibitions, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Biennial, the Tate Modern, the Barnes Foundation, the Rubin Museum of Art, and the Centre Pompidou Metz. His work is held in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute in Chicago, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Contemporary Art, just to name a few. So it's really exciting to introduce Sanford specifically because I've had the pleasure of knowing him for over 20 years. And to see the trajectory of his career is just amazing. What's also really special is that Sanford and Lea were dear friends, and they were both really involved in the early stages of each other's careers. And so for Sanford to be here and be a part of this feels really full circle for us as a family. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming Derek Fordjour in conversation with our 7th annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk honoree, Sanford Biggers.
That feels nice. Well, hello, Sanford.
Derek, how are you today?
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Wonderful.
It's a Morehouse talk. What do you want? Well, I just have to say, Sanford has been a friend to me and a beacon back when I was really nothing to look at or no one to care about, and you really looked out for me, and so it's an absolute honor to have this opportunity to talk to you tonight.
Thank you. And I want to say a few things just very quickly. This is an interesting convergent moment for me personally because of my deep respect and long-standing relationship with the Studio Museum in Harlem, my deep respect and long-standing relationship with Columbia University, long-standing relationship, deep respect for Harlem, for Morehouse College, but most importantly, and the reason we're here is for my dear, dear friend, Lea K. Green, who I miss. Many of you who know her miss her as well. But she's always with us. Thelma touched on something. She was full of so much energy and a bright smile, jokes for days, adventurous. She was literally my first studio manager in New York City. So she helped me get all my stuff together so I could talk to different curators and prepare for studio visits. And we spoke every single day when she was at Citibank and even beyond that. And we were each other's confidant, partners in crime, you name it, for many, many years. And I'm very honored to be here. And thank you to Lenny and Connie and the whole family for having me. It is an extreme honor. And you all know how close, Lea is to my heart. So thank you for having me.
Wow. People, I say all the time, Sanford, that you know, there's the artist, and then there's the friend of the artist. And the way you get a career going is by both. If you don't have people willing to cheer for you, then it's hard to get it going. And it sounds like Lea was part of that community for you.
Absolutely. Once again, Thelma said that Lea was, she always told it to you straight. You know, this works, this doesn't work. You should do it this way, you should not do it that way. She was very clear with that. And, you know, it's difficult to do that when you're with, you know, a stubborn artist who has to see things a certain way.
Yeah.
But she had that voice and the ability to communicate that.
Right.
And I also think the relationship that Thelma and Christine and Lea and all of us had in the very early days of, you know, this phase of the Studio Museum. Once again, I'm just so proud to be part of that history.
Absolutely. So speaking of history, a wonderful transition is I learned a lot about you in this process. Now, some of you might not know, but this is Sanford Biggers' early work. Isn't this great? You know, I never knew why he was so active in crits when he came to visit my studio. And I was like, this guy makes abstract work. You know, what is he doing? But Sanford is actually quite a drafts person. Sanford, so you started, you're from LA, and you did some early training with art in high school.
Yep. I worked with, well, actually I started as a graffiti artist, to be, you know, quite frank.
I mean, let's go there.
You know, hip hop happened around 77. I got wind of it. It wasn't hip hop, it was rap.
Right.
And I got wind of it around 79. My father took me and two of my friends to see the movie Wild Style that was at one theater in Los Angeles off of Melrose. And from that moment on, me and my boys had fat shoelaces and we were tagging and we were sneaking out at night and bombing on, you know, trains and in alleyways and all of that.
Like you had no home training.
Yeah, just no home training. Well, you know. And then finally I got busted by the cops, which was eventually going to happen. And they put the fear of God in me. And the next day or so I was in AP art classes.
Right.
And that's where some of this work comes from. This is like work that I was doing when I was 14, you know, 15 years old. I think these two, what's up right now? Those might have happened freshman year or so when I got to Morehouse, but.
Yeah, but you obviously were thinking about heavy things from the beginning. And that tagging action comes back in the work also. It's funny, we don't lose anything. But we both have fathers that were physicians. Sanford's dad was a neurosurgeon, a black neurosurgeon.
Coincidentally, that's how it worked out.
I mean, which is amazing. You know, my dad was an oral surgeon, but just say a little bit about the family you came from. I mean, it sounds like the Huxtables.
We're pre-Huxtabillion, and my name, Sanford, is actually pre-Sanford and Son. My sister's in the house right now.
Hey.
And I have to say that because Sean introduced me to Thelma. When I first started to come to New York early on. But yeah, coming from a family like that, you know, I have to say this about my father. Though he was a neurosurgeon, you have to put it in perspective. He came from the Jim Crow South, basically, and had this idea to become a neurosurgeon, which seems like an impossible endeavor at that time.
Yeah.
And he found every way to make that happen, from shining shoes to parking cars. He went to Dillard for undergrad, then ends up back in Texas for medical school, ends up in the top 3 of his class. Wow. He and another black student were the first 2. I think the #1 student was a woman at the time.
Wow. This is in Texas.
This is in Texas, probably late 50s, mid-late 50s or so. And at that graduation, they told him and the other black student they couldn't even come through the front door, which of course they did, and nothing happened, but they're like, come on.
Right.
So I came from that kind of family, and all that to say that my dad already was thinking way further than anything that I could have even dreamed of being contextually.
Absolutely.
But that being said, he was also a Renaissance person.
Right.
He loved poetry, he loved writing, he loved art, he loved music, he loved science, medicine, and so on. So for him, as long as you pursued it with the same type of vigor as an engineer, he was fine with it.
Wow.
But he just wanted to make sure that you were disciplined and going all the way. Just don't excuse my French, but half-ass it.
Right.
It was like, if you're about it, then I can respect it.
I love the image of this LA. It must have been a handsome guy looking at you, Sanford. But
You should take this on the road.
This Negro doctor, in Baldwin Hills, and he's eclectic and artist's son. I just love that image. I wish I could say the same, but my parents were African immigrants.
It was different,
a little
different program at the house. Well, my sister also was a dancer and started the first black classical dance group at Harvard, or was it TOE? Or yes.
Modern dance.
It was modern, okay. Anyway, but you were doing TOE when I was a kid and through high school. My brother, and she's a physician, my brother is an organic and biochemistry tutor, but he's also a bass player, and he was in a very early rap jazz fusion group called Alphabet Soup in San Francisco. So throughout the entire family, there was always sort of one hand in the arts and the creative and one hand in the sciences. And I think that manifested my work in terms of my research and the hours upon hours I spend going into, a deep dive into any subject that I go into my work.
Absolutely. So this LA history, which I associate LA, with creativity and, Hollywood and that kind of thing, you come from a really rich tradition of West Coast artists. One of my favorite books is a book called South of Pico by Dr. Kelly Jones, who's, yes, this is a book. And Dr. Jones is also a Columbia professor, right? Long time. I want to read a passage that she wrote about Sanford that really is a great introduction before we get to look at the rest of your work. She talked about singing Noguchi and Hammonds and many other artists, and then she said, and then there's Sanford Biggers, who seems to be their heir both to the peripatetic post-minimalist aesthetics of Noguchi and Hammonds, and to their relentless expression as performance. His works take many shapes and forms. They may appear indoors or out on walls and floors, as sculpture or video, drawings, scores, and music. At the center of this interdisciplinary work is a particular evanescence that reflects the spirit of his post-war predecessors. Bigger deflects. He becomes a facilitator, creating an archetypal or paradigmatic space. It is an approach to a kind of absence that Toni Morrison reminds us becomes a form of ornate presence. It is a way of escaping categorization. I just love that. So before we move into looking at more of your works, and I think it's important for you all to understand, Sanford has one of the most expansive practices I know as an artist. And we also have to talk about the fact that you're a black artist. And when you were making work, it wasn't the boon time that I've enjoyed. It was a different time. Don't let his face fool you. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, we'll go back one. So Sanford, after you left Morehouse, you went to MICA.
Well, I went to Japan first.
Went to Japan.
And I was in Japan for 3 years. And I think this is actually very important to that statement by Kelly. Japan fit really well around me. There was a sense of hypervisibility and invisibility. I became a student of Buddhism and started to learn about the middle way. And applying that to the notion of code switching and living in a sort of middle interstice here in the US as, people of color, minorities, whatever you want to call it, people who've had to find various ways and strategies to, navigate and succeed. So that was sort of built into sort of the social fabric of being in Japan. So that fit really well around me. And in addition to that, they used to put the most incredible trash out every week. And in Japan, they don't just throw stuff out. They clean it and put it out and, a nice format on a very small, footprint on the ground so that people can come in and actually look at it and potentially use it, because that's just how the Japanese do. And I started making found object sculptures from that experience, and also learning about wabi-sabi and the notion of the only true perfection is actually imperfection.
Right.
And that there is no permanence, that everything is ephemeral. Whether that be objects, whether that be finances, whether that be the body and ego.
Yeah.
And all of those things started to combine in my mind to make some of the bodies of work that and my approach to making work, I should say, and material, and crossing different forms of media.
So now kids love Japan. I mean, it's like, if you talk to anybody under the age of 18, they want to go to Japan. This was 20 years ago or so, right?
You're being so generous. It was
but
a little more than 20 years ago.
Yeah. But Sanford, why were you, I mean, most people that spend time at Morehouse College don't go to Japan after they graduate.
True.
Why did you do that?
I think this actually goes back to the family to some degree. My father making the choices he made, clearly he was not around several other people making that same choice.
Right.
When he got to LA, he found the community of other like-minded people who came from the Midwest and the South and the East to transplant to Los Angeles to pursue their professions. But they had to leave hometowns and the South to do that.
Right.
Me being, through Morehouse and even Japan, I always was sort of finding my own way and trying to figure things out. Japan happened because while at Morehouse, I wanted to study abroad, to study art. Italy was the place to go. Morehouse barely had an art program, and it definitely didn't have an exchange program.
Right.
So I took it upon myself, probably with some guidance from my sister more than likely, to look at different programs that might have, a cross-registration process.
Right.
So through Syracuse University, I applied to their Florence year abroad.
Right.
And I got signatures from all my teachers at Morehouse so that if I got the credits, that I could still graduate on time. So, I took care of all that. And so I made an exchange program between Morehouse to Florence to study art. And after getting back to the States, I ran into a couple of other friends who did some time, actually a good friend of mine from Memphis.
Is that right?
Who was in Japan. He was working on the Tokyo Stock Exchange his junior year.
Robert?
No. I'm going to forget his name right now.
Okay, don't do it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Anyway, when I met him, we were both, like 16, 17, getting to Morehouse, and, he was from Memphis.
Right. What does that mean, Sanford?
All that means is that when he called me from Japan that day and I got the suave metropolitan cat on the other end, it's like, Mr. Biggers, so how you been? Blah, blah, blah. I was like, what happened to you? So he said he'd been in Tokyo. I was like, whatever that is, I need some of that. So when I came back and graduated from Morehouse, I found all the countries that I was interested in because I got the travel bug.
Yeah.
And I'd already seen so much of Western Europe that I was like, let's go a little deeper.
Right.
And Japan sort of came up because there was an exchange in teaching called the JET program. And I went there and did that for 3 years.
Fascinating. I think you also revealed something, and I think they wanted us to talk a little bit about the Morehouse education. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of your preparation artistically, now there's a lot of social and historical and academic, but artistically, I'd say we got very little. And
I'd say I got my undergrad art degree from Spelman, basically.
Yeah.
Spelman, for those who don't know, is the sister or unofficial sister school across the street that actually had a robust art program at the time.
Still does, and that was my experience
very
too.
much now.
Yeah. So we went there for our majors. So what you described in putting together this traveling program, that's kind of what you learned there, how to do it yourself.
Absolutely.
I mean, which is amazing. And I mean, no knock to Morehouse, but it's a reality, right? So you were in Baltimore when you started these. I love showing these works because they make me think of Watts Towers and James, Outer Bridge and all these assemblage artists from Leimert Park. How did you first make your foray into this kind of constructivist approach?
Well, by the time I got back from Japan, I moved to LA for a couple of years and just really didn't know what I was doing. I saved up a lot of money from Japan and I made a studio in my parents' garage. I was doing music pre-production with a bunch of cats. I was working with, people who literally, some of them have become famous at this point. But we were all going to the clubs and the open mics and, performing and all that. But that wasn't really leading anywhere. And at a certain point, Varnett Honeywood, Spelman grad, important artist, the artist who did all the artwork in the back of the Cosby Show, to go back to the Huxtables.
That's right.
She befriended me at some point in LA, and through her I met Samela Lewis.
Oh, yeah.
And then she
From
introduced
Howard.
me to Dr. Leslie King Howard, who was then, I think, the dean of the graduate school at MICA.
Yeah.
And suggested that I do a post-bac.
Let's slow you down for a second.
Okay.
Do y'all know what the lineages he just ran through right there? right? Some of y'all feel that. So Varnette Honeywood, I mean, iconic work that we know, she's since passed. But then Samela Lewis, who is legendary with Howard, right? At Howard University.
Hampton.
Hampton, right, Hampton. And then the last one you said.
Dr. Leslie.
Dr. Leslie Hampton, which was running Micah. It's amazing. This is the Buddha, which starts to show up in the work. So it was there from the beginning. It looks like there's a Buddha wrapped in shoelaces, not to be reductive, but as a formal analysis. What these ideas of hip hop and Eastern philosophy, were they there from the beginning?
Through Leslie King Hammond, she said, your work needs to have more of you in it. And I was not interested in doing anything, representational in the sense of portraiture or things that literally look like me.
And why not?
I thought there was a limitation to it. I thought that it would become a hallmark and it would maybe not go any deeper than the surface. That was my thinking about that at that time. So I wanted to do things with objects, real things that were there physically and that I was not illustrating or trying to represent. And that also led to the belief that the object itself, the making of it, the deference you pay to it, the hands-on time, the use patina start to speak volumes, and that a viewer can actually absorb some of that. So the piece that you see here and that tall sort of totemic-looking figure that was in Baltimore are also sort of my inspiration from looking at pre-Columbian and African and early Asian objects, power objects. And trying to find a way to make objects that had that type of power, but also had more of a personal African-American soul, for lack of a better word.
And so you're thinking about these ideas and constantly doing performance. It sounds like you were always sort of, playing piano, spinning records. Naturally, you push this into the realm of performance. This is one of my favorite pieces of yours. So we're looking at let's give it up for that, by the way. Why don't you tell us what we're looking at?
So you're looking at a piece that is called the Mandala of the Bee Bodhisattva. Mandalas are spiritual diagrams that you find in Buddhism that have, I'm just giving you a very cursory description. And bodhisattvas are enlightened beings that are back in earth to help guide others. B-boys, B-girls are practitioners of the hip-hop arts. B-bodhisattva is a combining of those ideas. And this is very, autobiographical. I mentioned the movie Wild Style and growing up, learning from rap and hip-hop culture. And this was a way of manifesting that. So these are hand-cut rubber tiles to create the mandala. And then a video camera was put above the floor. And I worked with another artist, David Ellis, who introduced me to the Rocksteady crew and a bunch of breakdancers here in New York City. And this became the official dance floor for the Battle of the Boroughs breakdance competition in the South Bronx. So that image right there shows you, the very diverse age and otherwise group that was there to see this. And this was 2000. When this was displayed, you see it as a full floor, but also in a small recessed monitor at another spot in the room, you'll see a very small monitor that shows the actual documentation of the performance. And when this was finally shown, I think it was shown at PS1. I don't remember if this one was shown. It wasn't, okay. So it was at PS1, and I did the residency at the PS1 Clock Tower. And at that opening, I invited a lot of the dancers to come. Strictly to see the work. Because the moment they saw this as the official dance floor for the competition, they felt that they had arrived because no longer was it just linoleum or cardboard, it was an actual official floor. So, props to props, they were like, we're gonna come support you. So they came down and there was music, and if anyone wanted to perform, they could, but there was no mandate, there was no clock time, none of that. Because the performance was already encapsulated on the piece, the scuff marks. You can read the work and find out what had happened on it. The circular movements of the bodies echoed by the circular movements of the mandala.
Right.
But it also references, post-minimal, Carl Andre, and then all that whole artistic canon as well.
Yeah, horizontality, that whole conversation. So when these guys come in and start dancing on your artwork, does something magical happen for you? I mean, this is an activation, and this had to be the beginnings of your thinking. I mean, we return to this idea of power objects, activation, kind of embedded histories. What does that open up for you when you see that engagement?
Well, it's charging the object. So I said I didn't want to do things that were representational. So that means to make a power object, I literally have to put in the work to charge it.
Right.
In this case, it was providing the dance floor where others and their energy and their talent is now part of the piece.
Right.
And everywhere that piece has gone, every exhibition or museum it's gone to internationally, you can see the documentation, but you also can see the physical documentation. So now their story is, traveling. So for me, it's interesting. I think we talked about this at some point. Another one of the things that I've been interested in is this conversation about culture and syncretism.
Right.
So there's a syncretic thing happening when now you're combining Buddhism and breakdancing, and now it's charging these objects and the physicality that's visible there, but also it has an auratic energy around the piece. So.
And then it becomes its own artwork. The documentation, the performance, then becomes an artwork that can live in gallery spaces, museum spaces. And so what we're looking at here is your choice to project on the floor so that we have this almost mimetic relationship to the floor and the ground as viewers now circling a record of the performance. I mean, that's a lot of rigor in your choice to present that way, and you've activated the floor in many ways.
Well, we may talk about video at some point, and I've always worked through video, but one thing that you'll find in almost all my pieces with video is that there are objects attached to it. Video is not video for video's sake.
Right.
Video is also part of a larger dialogue with physical works or installations or the movement of bodies through the room and how they even engage with the video in the first place.
Right. The floor and the ceiling. This is, another, I mean, I love that when I enter your show, I don't know, it's disorienting in this great way. It's almost kaleidoscopic, the way you activate. I want to push forward and talk about this choice to use sand. And I've heard you talk about the installation of this piece and how people were very talkative on the first day of installation, and then something really interesting happens after that.
Yeah, so this coincidentally was down the street at a place called Triple Candy. Many of you might remember it. Very large space. Actually, Studio Museum is right there in that building right now, temporarily.
Right.
And this was a 20-foot by 40-foot piece, and as Derek has already mentioned, this is colored sand poured directly on the floor. So I worked with a team of friends and artists to create the piece, and yeah, the first day was very social, but after several hours of being on the ground and sifting sand by hand, you get into this extreme meditative state. So by the second or third day, it was just quiet in the entire room, but happiness. It was just very, very much like being in a seated meditation for an extended amount of time.
Wow. So then this becomes a record of that just kind of performance, even though it was installation, and I'm sure your wheels must be turning at that point. So one of your big breakout works, which I hate that language, sorry, but it's a talk. This piece really, is kind of mind-blowing. Talk a bit about this work and why. I mean, I could talk about why I think it resonated, but
well, you can click the next one because this.
Oh, do we see it?
We have some video.
Do we?
Yeah, go to the next
Okay,
one.
Eddie, let's do it.
Yeah, and it's quiet, so I could actually speak over it. So this was a piece that I started actually working on in grad school with a friend of mine, Jennifer Zackin, who's a woman from the East Coast, and we were at the Skowhegan residency and, just having conversations, and I had all this Super 8 footage, literally still on, film on reels,
right,
that I grew up watching with my family on Sundays. So it had a lot of powerful nostalgic value to me.
Yeah.
And I had them because I was like, okay, I've got to probably digitize this before this stuff deteriorates, but what can I do with it? And in that thought process, it turns out Jennifer had a bunch of Super 8 movies too. And the light bulb moment was like, well, let's see what yours has and what I have and what we can make from it. And it really became both families just doing basic, mundane family rituals. East Coast, West Coast, Christian, Jewish, boy, girl, and it's just basically identical. So it ends up being more of a conversation about class. And it was so similar that at certain points in the film, we actually cross the screen. And it takes you a while to even see that those two bodies have crossed. And this was shown here at Studio Museum, and then it was at the Whitney Biennial. And if you can go back to the previous image, yeah, that one. It was done as a full installation. So once again, the video is always sort of part of a more immersive situation. So for this, I made a family living room with simulated wood, paneled walls, shag carpet, an old couch, and a darkened space. And you walk in, and it's totally quiet, and you see these Super 8 films.
It takes such confidence to work this way. I mean, it's such a simple gesture. It really is the absence of the hand. I mean, it's a conceptual work. What happened for you that allowed you to know it was done and it had something?
I think it goes into sort of the Japanese philosophy and the stuff that I was reading and into at the moment. Definitely a bit of the wabi-sabi practice about,
I was gonna say, yeah.
The found object and the broken object actually being the perfect object. And this is found footage. And when you find this, there was nothing directed here. The real directors were our dads, basically.
Right.
So it was a found thing that I was almost at this point detached from.
See, this detachment is something that, I'm trying to reveal Sanford and his thinking to you. Are you with me? Do you see this happening? So this notion of detachment where you're able to point to families, bodies, with a kind of absence, the ideas of separate but equal, the statement actually builds as you consume the work, rather than this kind of, didactic relationship to content. Speaking of objects, I mean, you made a move into objects in a big way. Did anybody see this piece at Brooklyn Museum? Can we give it up for this? This is like one of the greatest hits. This was epic, man.
Yeah, so the piece is called Blossom. And it's also, once again, resting in a dichotomy between the Buddha finding enlightenment under a tree, but also the history of bodies hanging from trees here in the US, and how the tree hasn't changed. It's really about society and culture changing around it. I view art the same way. A work that is sometimes ignored in one decade can be the most important work the next decade, and then be in infamy the next decade. So nothing is static, and that's what you're alluding to in the work. Nothing's static, nothing's really permanent. There is a transience in all of the work, but what remains, and I've literally had shows called What Remains is the impact it has on the viewer and the conversations that viewers have amongst each other. I think that's the goal. These are just triggers or ways to get you there, but that's ultimately where the goal is.
That's beautiful. So Sanford, on a work like this, at a practical level, we have many artists in the audience. It must have been ridiculous to get this tree in there.
Yeah, it is. So, my relationship with objects, and this is something that I had to learn and unlearn and relearn and unlearn many, many times. I understand objects very well. My mother was one of the most fantastically aesthetically gifted people ever. She knew what worked on any level for the senses. And I got that from her. And I had to avoid being obsessed with the aesthetics of pieces to get into a deeper realm. That's sort of what got me into the more conceptual and the more ephemeral, to not depend on the object. That being said, I also, and you saw the early drawings, I believe in having some facility with these things so you can get that point across.
Right.
So that tree is sculpted. It took a lot of research to figure out how to do that. I worked with some technicians to figure out some ways. We made stamps and rubber stamped of bark and found ways to get artificial leaves. I re-engineered the piano. It was a regular piano. Now it is a MIDI player piano.
Wow.
and the keys are moving when you walk into the space, and it's playing my own rendition of Strange Fruit, which is also a cross-cultural, collaborative piece of American history.
Yeah.
Abe Mirapool and Billie Holiday.
Right. But also through your own interpretation.
I couldn't give it to you straight.
And he always, one of the best pieces of advice I got came from Neri Ward, who said, everything should filter through you. And the fact that you had your own translation, I think, is also your presence and absence again in this way that continues to show up. I love this ghetto bird.
Yeah, so there were 3 of these. This is the second iteration, the full-length version for, the gentleman. There was a smaller one that was a waistcoat that was for like teens, but I came up, I was invited to do a show in Princeton. And we were given access to the collection of this encyclopedic museum and commissioned to make responses to some of the work. So I worked specifically in the Greco-Roman, Renaissance, pre-Columbian, and African section. And it just so happened that it was winter and I was looking for a new coat. And I was looking at all these goose downs that were really popular at the time. I was like, what if the feathers were on the outside? So sometimes it could be just that simple.
Right.
But when you start to build that out, it becomes quite beautiful, almost majestic. But in the context of that show, it was put in a vitrine and it was, intervened into the African section with all these other ritual use objects and some video and documentaries showing how they might have been used. So I said this one was basically the ghetto bird tunic. Growing up in Los Angeles, we always had the presence of police helicopters flying around.
Right.
So you knew when the ghetto bird was out. That's the ghetto bird. So we would see the ghetto bird flying, and it came apparent to me, part of being a graffiti artist, is if you could be out and avoid being caught by the ghetto bird, that is your rite of passage. You can live, you can walk another day. So this is a coat to aid in that.
Wow.
That's how it was contextualized, but it had to be charged. So if you go back to that other image, you see the object by itself, but then you see Terry Adkins, who also has a very deep history with the Studio Museum in Harlem, and was one of my mentors.
Yeah.
And a musician, multi-hyphenate. And that's him wearing the ghetto bird tunic in a performance we did together at the Kitchen. Saul Williams has worn it, Satch Hoyt has worn it, Martin Luther the singer has worn it, and the next picture is Baron Claiborne's photograph of me in the coat. So all those bodies and all that energy has charged that piece.
Man, and all that history. I mean, to think about the legacy of the late Terry Atkins and your work, performance, object, instrumentation, music. I mean, I love that bridge. Yeah, that's really fantastic. Thinking about hip hop deconstruction, this was an earlier work, right? 06. And we see you dealing with this notion of erosion, which kind of comes up again, or decay. This was an epic installation that I saw. Did anybody go to Mass Mocha and see this work? Oh, you missed it. It was quite a moment. I drove all the way up there and I was so satisfied.
It was a wonderful show, but it's far away.
Yeah, I love to travel for art, and I really was blown away by your connection with John Biggers, the artist, in this piece in particular. John Biggers is a relative of yours, and he was your muse for this work in a way.
John is extended family in the way that Black folks have extended family. My parents knew John. My mom was friends with Hazel, who was his wife, and my father and John met, probably in their 20s or 30s at some point. And throughout the decades, they had contact with each other, always trying to find out a little bit more of where the name Biggers came from. And I think I told you a few weeks ago that there's a third person who enters in that story, Mel Edwards.
Right.
And it turns out we believe all of our families were in the same plantation.
Wow.
In North Carolina.
Wow.
But John Biggers makes a very important trip to Ghana in 1957, which changes his work from what would be sort of like a social realism and part of the WPA camp. And then he starts to embrace sort of this hybrid patterned sacred geometry format.
That's right.
And quite honestly, that inspiration got me as deep as I'm into patterns, from the mandalas all the way through the quilt works that you'll see. And you can barely see it here, but on that upper mezzanine is a reproduction of one of his famous murals in Texas that's literally called the Quilting Party. And the rest of the installation was made from objects that I found in one of the warehouses attached to Mass MoCA, and then I constructed the plexiglass pews to sort of make that ascendant church-like space.
I love the fact that Biggers enters that sort of pattern coding conversation from pictorial space. I mean, he was always sort of rendering, but you were kind of on that bridge with him and in conversation with him from a pictorial and then a more conceptual of like pattern and building. This was really epic, monumental space. Mass MoCA is huge.
Yeah.
Did you just sit in the middle of the floor for a while and
cry? Yeah. It was like, this was one of the places, though, for me, when I was in grad school, I dreamed about showing at Mass MoCA because to even handle that space takes a certain amount of, creativity, fearlessness. Moxie, yes, all the above. And I literally did feel like I got punched in the gut every single time I walked into that space until I started to devise ways to either collapse or expand on the space and really take into account the environment, which I think is part of doing installation and sculpture, is a sensitivity to the context, both conceptually and physically around that space.
Right. Beautiful. And the idea of the mandalas, this is etched glass. And if you could see closely, these are the cross sections of a slave ship. And so I guess the earlier works had, the Eastern, but now you're moving more into sort of the archival from a slavery conversation. Talk about that evolution.
I mean, I think it was a reaction to being more consistently in the US for periods of time.
Right.
When I was living abroad, I was literally gone for years. And even after grad school, I would do residencies that would take me away for months at a time, but I was starting to spend more time here, and sadly, the issues that have always been present here, which are still present here, started to filter into the work, and I was trying to find ways to negotiate that.
Right.
And that's where that Lotus piece came from. I want to include a slide, but I did a version of that Lotus piece in steel that is on the side of a building in the Bronx. It's around almost a 30-foot diameter Lotus that is on the side of the Eagle Academy for Young Men.
That's right.
That was my first public commission.
Yeah. So that was your first one. So this next transition I'm going to set up before we go here, it shows you the broad range of Sanford Biggers and how he can go from something so poignant as slavery and meditation to humor.
Yeah.
I have to tell you about my relationship with this work. So, So I went to a show downtown, and it was Nicola Vassell, who now has a gallery, but she had a pop-up show. And I'm like going through the shows, tons of work in there, because that was before we could have galleries the way we do now. So we had to hit it hard, and so there's a lot of work in there.
Yeah, the show was called Black Eye.
The show was actually called Black Eye. And I turn the corner and I see this shirt and I'm like, this picture, and I'm like, who did this? You know what I mean? Like, what? I was just so shocked.
I mean, I think I'm a big fan of artists who can show different tones, different tonalities in their work. It's one thing to talk about tone when we're talking about a painter who's been using a certain palette for a certain amount of years and then they change their palette and so on, and that's a tonal shift. And then you have things that are a little bit more aggressive, let's say, like Guston changing his format.
Right.
For me, I believe that you can be an artist and work in many different ways and tie it all together and have some tonal difference in there. It's like listening to a good record.
That's right.
It's not a straight line. It's not a linear thing. And, back to Buddhism, there are no straight lines, basically. Everything is circuitous in some way. This piece is actually very personal, beyond the fact that I went to Morehouse. But this is a dear friend of mine who, interestingly enough, years after Lea was no longer my studio manager, she was my studio manager for a while. Samantha Best was, she was never a student of mine when I taught at VCU, but I met her when she was graduating and I was moving back to the city and she was moving to New York. And she came in to be my studio manager for a while. But it turns out that when Samantha was growing up in Hampton, Virginia,
Right.
she used to do pageants. Her parents pushed her into pageants. So she was a pageant girl as a kid, and she hated it. And she, you know, this was like a whole dark spot on her whole life, and she was traumatized by it. And when she was about to leave, and I was about to get a new studio manager, and she was moving on to her next phase, I was like, let's do this project. And I'm gonna ask you to do something that I know you hate, but I think will be therapeutic for you. And let's make an artwork to show, you know, it's part of a commemoration of our time together. So one Sunday, I got all these Morehouse t-shirts. I had just come back from reunion,
Right.
so I had the shirts in tow. And then we went over to the Staten Island to a mall and went to a Glamour Shots.
Oh, I love it.
So this is one of the pictures from the series, and there's probably four or five other ones, including her with a bunny, another one with her looking sort of, you know, like she's disciplining somebody, and another with her sitting on the Easter Bunny.
Right.
So it was just total camp, you know, something you can do in 2 hours at the mall at the
Right.
Glamour Shots.
Right.
But it was specifically for that show because I was like, I don't want to do this huge thing. I don't want to do a sculpture or an installation. This has to be quick. Let's
Right.
go.
Right.
So we did the shot and it just sort of worked.
I remember we were in the same building with studios for a few years, and I remember you having a conversation with me about coding and how an artwork can be read on many levels, and every level doesn't have to get everything. And this was one of those moments where I was in stitches looking at this work, and other people were confounded. Right.
People were
There were people upset.
People were upset.
You know, and so you had us all, you know, doing a different thing. But that's part of your wizardry. Another moment when this happened for me, and I have to tell you all about this piece. I don't know if anybody remembers. I went to Miami. This is where I saw this work. Blew my mind. Now, I have to give context around this work. This is a fan talking. I'm going to let you talk too, Sanford. But this happened when, first of all, this is Fat Albert. There might be some millennials here. But no shade, no shade, no shade. I'm just saying. I'm a moderator. It's Fat Albert. But the Fat Albert was breathing up and down. This was also at a time when Bill Cosby was coming into the news.
Bill Cosby was the creator of Fat Albert, for those who don't know.
Oh, right, important detail. But also, Bill Cosby was just starting to...
I'll go back to the other one. The other one's breathing, I think. This one? Is it?
No, I think it's the next one. Yeah. But Bill Cosby's career was starting to unravel.
Well, his tendencies were laid bare. Yes.
That's one. At the same time, the Staten Island arrest where Eric Garner was killed by the police. And I Can't Breathe was starting to happen. So Sanford does this work in the midst of both of these things happening, and it is just so of the moment and so relevant. How did you arrive at this work?
Around 10 years prior to that, I proposed an idea to do a giant inflatable Fat Albert in Central Park. Like 20 foot tall, standing up, sort of, hey, Googling it around, bopping around. I didn't get the commission. So they weren't ready for it yet.
They weren't ready.
So 2015, I'm like, well, what if he's laying down and the pump is now just giving these slow breaths? He's not necessarily dead. His eyes are open. He is breathing. But he is down.
Right.
And to be honest with you, this was visceral frustration and anger at all of those things, the confluence of all those things happening. But this was also coupled with other work.
Right.
In the show that you saw.
That's right, Bam.
So yeah, that's just, I'll say that for now. We can get into a little bit more about it later, but, where's the other pieces not there? You know where to go.
There
right?
it goes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the other work that it was.
No, but Michael. It was also in a show with this other work that will come up at some point. Mm-hmm. There we go.
Bam! I saw this.
So.
This was powerful too.
And let's go to the next slide. So that was a very small video. At this point, I'm still working in video, but I'm doing very short format work. Mm-hmm. And this is also in response to that trend when we started having the phone documentation of all the brutality. The brutality had been happening forever, obviously, but now we actually have footage of it. So we were no longer crying wolf to the US, that the US was looking at all this being perpetrated. So the remnants of that piece then get cast into bronze, and that was sort of a way of resurrecting that person. All of these pieces in this series are named after victims of police brutality. And this, is a very small sculpture next to this sort of enormous inflatable. And on a formal level, you're dealing with like the ephemeral, the light, the air, and then the bronze and the permanent, in an impermanent reference to people whose lives are transitory.
That's right.
So all this stuff was happening. That was the dynamic between those works together. So what, if you just glance at the Fatal Burt, I don't call it Fat Albert, I call it Fatal Burt.
Oh, bars.
Fatal Burt and Lea K, which references one of the most iconic sculptures that Western Europeans will tell you it's the most iconic sculpture. But the Lea K and conflating all that together was a way of sort of processing all of this that was happening culturally here in the US at that time.
It was a very powerful moment. I want to go back to speaking about collaboration, and we're going to talk a little bit about Moon Medicine. You're a major performer, but you also collaborated with Santigold, the recording artist. This was a party I went to. It was an amazing party. I don't know if any of you guys went to it. It was great. I might have snuck in. But you did these cloud forms that were hanging from the building, the ceiling. Talk about this collaboration.
So the clouds, the clouds come back from my interest in Buddhist imagery, and often you see waves depicted and clouds. These clouds happen to be made of raw cotton that are clumped together and then hung from the ceiling. And then far in the distance, you see what looks like a red female figure with a raffia skirt. If you go to the previous image, you'll see a better picture of her. And this is from an installation that I did at the Sculpture Center in 2011. This ran concurrent to the show at the Brooklyn Museum that had the Blossom piece. So soon after that, I was invited to commemorate the closing of the Roseland Ballroom, which is one of the most iconic live performance spaces in Manhattan, and it was smack dab in Midtown. And this was their final last hurrah. So it was myself, Questlove, and Santigold were basically provided all the sonic and design attraction for the evening. So if you go back to that shot from the actual party itself, you'll see her far in the back. So this was also a way of charging this work, and taking it out into a place where people are almost engaging in this, for lack of a better word, pagan ritual underneath this fetish object that was also done in red vinyl, so it's really a double fetish. But I show that next to the BAM bronze pieces because this is also a reinterpretation of these power objects. And if you go to Art Basel and you see all of the fervor over any particular work, in current society we have power objects that are still functioning in some type of way, whether it be commercially or contextually. So I've just sort of really focused on the actual fetish objects and trying to reinterpret and add new language to that. Oh, and then that small one was also commissioned by the Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson to be the last piece that's visible as you're leaving the Equal Justice Initiative museum.
We have to plug that museum, which is amazing. It's in Montgomery. Have you guys been there? It's amazing. My wife is a lawyer and worked with Brian and took me there and blew my mind. Take your families, please go tell your friends. Some wonderful artists, including Sanford, Hank, many others have worked there. And these are some more fetish objects that we'll see from you and video happening at the same time, right? Which I guess builds on the BAM work.
Mm-hmm. I think we can move because I think we're getting a little tight on time.
Yes. Let's talk about the big one.
Okay.
Let's give it up for the big boy. Huh? Rockefeller Center.
So obviously this is still coming out of that interest in fetish objects, but the language is now starting to change a bit, where I'm actually fusing Greco-Roman and neoclassical works, which for those who don't know, the Greeks usually made it, the Romans bit off of it a few hundred years later, and then the rest of Europe and the rest of the world keeps recopying and recopying and recopying. So it's sort of like a rap battle that's been going on in art history. And I got very interested in that idea. Let's go back to the Oracle first. And how to, using those processes of cutting and pasting and copying these iconic images, but then throwing in new information. So you have these hybridized Africoid type of sculptural faces and busts and masks that are now appearing on these Greco-Roman bodies, these iconic bodies. And it's an exploration of the hierarchy, art historical hierarchy, notions of beauty, power, and so on.
And we do see this. I mean, these are some of the you took over the entire plaza, right?
Yes.
And so these are your flag works where we see sort of those cloud waveforms, return. But also in your gallery works, we see the same idea of duality between that Eurocentric and the African, kind of mashing up, which is also very hip hop, though. I mean, you're kind of like, is that fair to say? I mean,
it is. It's hip hop, but it's also, I think, it goes even deeper into sort of African American visual culture.
Right.
If you think of patchwork.
Right.
I mean, that's not even limited to African American, but patchwork, cutting and pasting, hip hop for sure. That fine line between syncretism versus appropriation.
Right. Right.
Those conversations are interesting to me.
Right. And they're quite relevant. These are marble works, which I don't know how you must have, how do you manage these works?
I work with a quarry in North Italy, which came out of my time in Rome doing the American Academy in Rome. And I regularly go there and we pick slabs of marble. And I think one of my partners, Mark, is here. We do a lot of work designing and coming up with some of these forms.
Right.
And then I go over there and watch the process. And then when we get to the hand level of it, we just go into deeper and deeper detail. But it's interesting, this work started from a conceptual space, but then I got trapped by the obvious, that when you start to confront marble and some of these materials in person, you get struck by the same things the original artist did. And it becomes about form and gesture and tone. And what can you make these inanimate materials express? So, I start to noodle a lot more with how I manipulate some of these things as well. The ones you're looking at right here, the previous view you saw were frontal views of masks that many of you have probably seen. But when you go to the back, you see the impression of what potentially were people who put those masks on. So now we're talking maybe even cultural appropriation.
Right.
Who's wearing who?
Right.
Which culture is consuming the other?
Right.
Is it parasitic? What kind of symbiotic relationships are there? And then you also have the formal, where those are literally imprints into the material, but the way you look at them, the way that light hits them, looks like they're coming out too. So now you don't really know which are the actual masks.
Right. It's the inverse.
It's like the Janus form. Once again, iconic, historical work. It's the Janus.
So speaking of that, kind of like two forms, this work is on exhibition now at the Orange County Museum, which from the front looks very dimensional, almost sculptural, and from the back we see this sort of flattening. So this is, how large is this work?
This work I think is around 20 feet, somebody correct me, 20 feet across, tall, what did we say, 18, 15? 15, yeah. And you'll see some other works where this came from, but I've been making works that are using two-tone sequins, so one set of sequins are mirrored and the others are black, and I'm able to draw within that material to create these images. The one that's in Orange County is, a freestanding outdoor version of some of these pieces. And it's flat on the facade, but when you see it in person, it does feel volumetric. It feels like it is literally carved out of some mysterious material. And then you get up close, you can start to see the back, which is a flat. And I'm borrowing directly from stagecraft and things you see in Hollywood and Broadway and theater to make a panel that looks like something on the front, using trompe-l'oeil and forced perspective and so on. And in the back, it's just sort of ad hoc, provisional, whatever can make it stand up.
Right.
But there's a hidden trick with that. Let's go to the back image of the quilt of the Orange County piece. So straight ahead, this is really lifted from a quilt pattern, a very sort of iconic quilt pattern. And it looks straight ahead when you're looking at it straight ahead. But if you veer off that axis, the whole diagram starts to decompose a little bit. So it's an anamorphic drawing too. So it's really about illusion after illusion after illusion. Trompe-l'oeil, anamorphic drawing, high contrast to create the image, whether it's flat or whether it's volumetric. And what better place to explore illusion than California? So, it was a commentary too about Hollywood and, growing up in Los Angeles and knowing how much everything is about appearance.
That's right.
On some level. And then you rarely see what's happening.
Right.
The nappiness in the back. So that is part
what's
of
real and what's not. And so speaking of that kind of trompe-l'oeil play, these works, which I love, actually, you actually work in the shadow. I mean, you've rendered the shadow, but related it to a three-dimensional object on the floor. So you're playing with flatness in a way that activates the wall here. Is this sort of, another way of code switching, flatness and dimension?
Well, it's about, dualities, or just sort of pushing the notion, once again, of illusion and creating sculptural physical space out of two-dimensional objects, playing between the minuscule and, the grandiose. These sculptures that are on the ground are handmade. I make these directly in the studio, but once again, if we're talking about these power objects and if they are embedded with powers and souls and spirits and so on, what would those actually look like if we could see them? So in this series, I'm basically projecting those shadows and extending them to the wall. But when you engage with these in person, it's very hard to start delineating what is real space. Even from that image right there, they almost look like they're off the wall.
Right.
And these are, once again, hard contrast, trompe-l'oeil, basic formal stuff that you learn in art school, but pushing that to the extreme.
Yeah. Trompe-l'oeil means fool the eye. I mean, many of you know that, but I just love that. The quilt works. We can't talk about your work without talking about your iconic quilt works. When did you make a foray into quilts, and how and why did you find them so generative?
That happened probably around 2007, where I was invited to do a show in Philadelphia. But the inspiration came from a few different forms, from quilts that were around our house, quilts at our grandparents' house in Texas, the G's Ben show at the Whitney. That was huge, not just because of how beautiful it was formally, but there was such a highly charged political aspect to seeing this group of black women whose work is in the Whitney.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, was better than a lot of the paintings that were up at the time.
Right.
So that play right there was interesting.
Yeah.
So I'd already been working with ready-mades and discarded material, so I started to work with antique quilts, quilts that were in disrepair, quilts that were gifted, things that I can find at thrift stores and so on, some on eBay, and then to patchwork them into new generative works. I think this is, there we go. So once again, I think it goes back also into my interest in pattern that you were seeing in the mandala works as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but when you start to work two-dimensionally, and I guess in a more pictorial space, these ideas of being seen and unseen and hiding, you really seem to have a deep engagement now with painting language. I mean, it seems to be a full circle moment for you where you're making aesthetic decisions in these quilts. Do you feel like you spent enough time, or you were able to bring something from all the other works into two dimensions now? I mean,
Yes, because when I engage with these, I don't think about, although I am, conscious of pictorial space, that is not sort of the goal.
Right.
These are objects. They're not really two-dimensional. They have the imprint of the body in there, just like a used material would. They have an auratic energy coming off of them. They have things that are in disrepair, so sometimes I'm literally repairing it. And sometimes I'm playing to the pattern and the rhythm of what's already there, and sometimes I'm playing against it. So there's a physicality that's there, as well as dealing with some of the pictorial space.
And building on that, they become sculptural again. I mean, so we're seeing you take these from 2 to 3 back to 2 dimensions, and these are now standing sculptures that are clearly kind of kaleidoscopic, but you were able to kind of explore the potential of the quilt. Yeah.
Well, I always, looking at thousands of quilts, I always imagine them as three-dimensional. Just even in their two-dimensionality, I'm imagining all this extra dimension there. And because of the materials, or because it's not really the quilter's desire to create that forced perspective, that's something that really is inherent in drawing and painting. Yeah. My early interventions were really to try to find ways to minimally add a mark or a gesture that could open up those quilts as if they were portals.
Yeah.
Like you could literally walk through them. And the logical progression of that was then to start making them into three-dimensional objects that no angle would give you the same view. So they're kinetic in a sense. Even though they're stationary, as you move around them, they're constantly changing their view and form, and the shape itself and the images on them, or at least the patterns on them.
So speaking of form, I think this is a great place for us to conclude, because I'm sure people want to throw questions, is your performance work, and this as another form, that you've taken. I don't know if you all have seen Sanford.
Let's go to, those are film stills, because we were going to talk about film and video, but I think it's actually more apropos to look at this last performance clip.
Okay.
Because a lot of the videos I've been working on the last few years have found their ways into live performance. So I have a group called Moon Medicine, and it is a revolving cast of musicians and creators, dramaturs, singers, you name it. And we do different versions of shows depending on the venue that we're doing the actual gig at. But the main form that has been taking the last probably 5 or 6 years has been a 5-piece band with Mark Hines on bass or drum, electronic drums, and video. Jahi Sundance on turntables. Jahi Sundance is also part of Robert Glasper's band and used to be part of Michelle and David Cello's band. We also collaborate with. Martin Luther, the singer from the San Francisco Jazz Philharmonic, and he used to be part of the Roots. And the bass player is Andre Simone, who was part of Prince's original band and helped create the Minneapolis sound.
So it's a real band.
It's a real band, yes.
It's not like a little art band.
So, yeah, it gets a little tricky. So when I get asked to perform, people think it's like something I just do.
Right.
Like I'm just going to perform. It's like I play with real musicians. I'm not just going to sit there and play, chopsticks or something like that.
Right.
I play with band.
Right.
I got to have chops to keep up with them.
Exactly.
So it takes time.
Yeah.
But I'll show you, this is just a clip we performed at Lincoln Center a few years ago. And this is us performing a couple of originals and the cover.
It's great. It's really good.
And the video in the back is one of the more recent video projects I've been working on. And this one was shot in Salvador de Bahia, and I think there's some parts that were shot in northern Ethiopia.
There's no shine at the bottom of the sea. Your eyes They turn me. Why should I stay here? Why should I stay? I'd be crazy not to follow where you lead. Your eyes, they turn me. Turn me on, you phantom. Follow to the edge.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end. I think the crowd recognizes how impossible it is to do Sanford Biggers in 1 hour.
So I just want to thank Derek and Sanford so much before we open up to audience questions. Also, any moment to recontextualize Radiohead, I am totally here for. So thank you. So if anyone does have any questions, we have 2 microphones at the bottom. If you do need a microphone brought to you, please let us know. Also, for those on Zoom, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat, and one of our team members will ask the question on your behalf. But while we wait for anybody who has a question, I do want to bring up a point of conversation, because this presentation was literally one of the most inclusive conversations about art history that I think I've seen, like, ever. And I want to thank you. It's literally a curriculum. It's a curriculum that we will have this program posted on our website afterwards with captioning, but we could literally, for any academic or educator in this space, this conversation, you could literally line by line, the amount of artists and historical periods is such a rich gift. And so with that, I wanted to bring it back to talking about an initiative that the 2 of you are working on to reinstate or invigorate a studio art program for the Atlanta University Consortium. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about that before any other questions come up.
And I think really briefly, the art program at Morehouse and Spelman is gone. And the Atlanta University Center, so Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Atlanta University, used to be able to get a bachelor's degree in studio arts, which is what we both did. You can't do that anymore. COVID took it away. So Sanford and I and many of our wonderful friends are going to come together, and hopefully with the help of studio, and have a big auction and raise some money and endow a chair so that we can put that department back and it'll never go away. So. Yeah.
We have a question.
Hi, my name is Tennille Mack, a Spelman 21 alum. And I'm so grateful to be present during this wonderful conversation. It's fully inclusive, as Dayan mentioned, and just well-rounding of your career, and Derek, where you stand in his career. And my question is in regards to, what did the community while you were in the AUC look like of students, and how has that been instrumental in making sure that you're grounded and even expansive in your thought process?
Wow. So when I went to Morehouse eons ago, my sister went to Harvard and my brother went to Berkeley. They're a little bit older than me. And they were in their sciences and medicine, and they were super smart. And I had to figure out a way to find myself. And I got really into art very early. However, when it came time to go to college, didn't think I was ready to go to an art school at that point because I could see myself burning out. I wanted to have a more broad-based education, and also at that time, there were very few successful, black role models. There were artists, and that's fine, admirable, so on, but there's no way to sell that to your parents, So there were a lot of questions, and I was just so young. I figured I would go to a liberal arts college, and I did a visit to Morehouse, and this was the time when Spike Lee had just come out of Morehouse, and he was making films. Sam Jackson had recently come out. You had all these politicians who went there, Martin Luther King, you already know the rundown. So it seemed like a very viable place to go at that time. And the weird thing of it not really having a proper studio program at Morehouse, it forced me to go to Spelman to do a lot of my classes. But I also developed a really close relationship to Frank Toby Martin, who was my sculpture instructor, who saw potential in me, gave me the keys to the studio and said, you're my monitor, you're cleaning up, you're watching out for this place. Then he helped me get a job. I got a job at Chick-fil-A, and they wanted me to be the manager and cut off my locks and my earrings at the time. I was like, I quit the next day. And Frank helped, Toby helped me get a job as an apprentice for a sculptor. And that sort of, put me really hands-on as an artist at a very young age, while I was still able to get a liberal arts, more broad-based education. So, that led me to Italy and so on.
Thank you.
Beautiful question. Yeah.
Wait, Derek, do you want to reminisce too?
So I went to Pratt in New York, and I dropped out because I was miserable. And it was just weird. I'm from the South. So I was trying to pledge a frat and go to art school, and they would call the cops on us when we had a step show. It was just it was too much, But I went to Morehouse frustrated, and it changed my life because I got a class in African American art history that exposed me to this lineage of black artists that have been working since slavery. There were slaves that went door to door, painting portraits of white families, and there were workshops where there were woodworkers that made staircases, so from that lineage all the way to Samela Lewis and all these guys. So it did ground me and show me that I was not this exception, that there was a history and a lineage, and I continue to work in that tradition as a result.
Hi, I'm Robert Gibbons. Pleasure to meet both of you. Thank you to Thelma Golden and Studio Museum. I have a question, and either one of you can answer that question. Museums being intimidating spaces for people of color. What are some of the challenges either one of you have witnessed of access or the challenges for people of color to be a part of the museum dynamic?
For me, museums were really where my focus was on when I came out of grad school. We hadn't yet gotten over to the place where we are now, where young black artists have gallery representation, museums are showing their work. We weren't quite there yet. So my strategy back then was to do residencies, and through those residencies, I met curators, often young curators, who were starting to work for museums, and we started relationships, and they started to place me in some museum shows or projects and so on. So I got my entree that way. And it made sense for the work I was making as well, because it provided a lot more context for my work. So I think I was very fortunate with my relationships with that, but that was very targeted on my part at that time. I don't know how you...
Yeah, I mean, Sanford is speaking, as an artist, but I think you were also interested as an audience member navigating a museum space. Yeah. So number one is that more black artists need to be present in collections, and that work is happening. I think the Studio Museum, which is building a new space, which we're all very excited about. I think Studio is going to join that conversation in an even more impactful way with the new building. But the Studio also becomes a model for other museums, I think. And I'm not sucking up to Thelma because she asked me to do this talk. But she has run an institution where she's brought in young curators underneath her since the beginning. And they're like this little army, mighty and small, like an armadillo.
And they're everywhere.
But they have gone out to populate the country, the world. And so You know, I say all the time she's an institution, but when we have representation from a curatorial standpoint, you start to see some things change, but also at a board level.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a money game. You know, at the end of the day, behind the scenes, who's in those boardrooms making those decisions really matters. So diversifying boards is really important. It's not easy work because the checks are really big, but we're figuring it out. And I think Studio Museum is leading that conversation. Yeah. You could go. We know you don't need a microphone.
Let me just in case for the people who are.
You do want a microphone, right? So okay.
Speaking about performance.
Hi. Okay. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your comfort with shift of tone. I mean, to be very honest, the very first time I saw your work, it was a minstrel show. And we were in a club situation, and I was with a black friend, but we were surrounded by non-black people. And I remember leaving both fascinated, but also horrified because of the conversation that was going on around me by people who may not have had the historical context. And my friend, very astutely, said to me, he shifts his tone and he explores. And obviously, I have become very comfortable with that, and that's why I'm here, because I am a fan. But I'm interested in how this shifting of tone allows you to navigate the gaze, given that your work might have at one point been for a smaller, more educated audience, and now that African American art has become so trendy and everyone wants it. So how do you navigate that and make sure that the purpose and meaning of your work gets through and is not taken lightly or for granted? Or
Okay. For the first part, to be fair, there was a pamphlet that was provided for that show.
I was
not
insulting
No,
that.
no,
It's
no,
not-
I'm-
everyone
I'm-
just didn't read the pamphlet.
I'm
Yes.
just giving more context for those who don't know about it. And there was no blackface in that show. There was somebody dressed as a geisha in that show. There was that. But it did start with two white singers on a porch swing singing Lift Every Voice and Sing with a totally new arrangement. Lift Every Voice and Sing is the Black national anthem. Afterwards, Harry Belafonte, who was in the audience, who happens to be black, came up and told them that that was his favorite version of that song, which he'd heard 1,000 times. But there was Erykah Badu and Jay Electronica. There were black folks in there, but it was mixed. It was downtown, for sure. But it was also dealing with postmodernism. There was a lot of theatrical tropes, and I actually called it a post-minstrel cycle. So there was verbiage around it addressing the tropes.
Titles be good.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's the issue, because there was so much depth and so much meaning and so much. And I am not in any way trying. I'm sorry if my use of the term minstrel show narrowed people's focus into the wrong place, because that's not what I'm saying. But for people who maybe didn't catch all of those layers.
Sure. Well, you know, that's an ongoing thing. And I think as an artist, sometimes we put it out there to figure it out. It's an experiment. I mean, I don't have all the answers putting it out there. That's what we do. That's the generosity of being an artist and the vulnerability of it. Once it's out there in the world, it could be totally misconstrued.
Totally.
And we have to deal with that each time. But you develop a thick skin, and you just have to stay intent with your focus and figure out your language as everyone else figures out how to understand your language.
And I think also, going back to the HBCU conversation, the Morehouse conversation, when you graduate, you know who you are. And you're going into a white world that might not know, and it's not your work to explain. And we're certain of that. And I think that's a great illustration of what we get. Oh, okay. Yeah. Know thyself, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that is something that we do take from our Morehouse experience, is that Sanford is probably very comfortable dealing with this information publicly because he's done all the right things, and you know, it's not all that anxiety. I'm sorry you went through that. It's very traumatic. Mm-hmm. But you know, that's not our work.
Well, I mean, it was also the same with that Morehouse piece, you know, and there was people attacking it for certain reasons, but then there's the other side of it is like, Morehouse was founded by white guys.
Right.
What if their great-great-great-great-grandkid wanted to wear a Morehouse shirt that their great-great-great-grandpappy made? Yeah, it's a Morehouse shirt. It just so happens. Sometimes things are a little bit more mundane, but it is that. It is the conversation that maybe you have with somebody around you that makes the work live beyond the performance, live beyond the exhibition. The fact that we're talking about it now, that was what, 15 years ago?
Yes.
Something happened. That's what we're trying to do. You know, that's sort of the ineffable.
That's what yeah. I think that's a compliment to the work. I mean, think about how that would have been if everything was nice and tidy, nothing to talk about. You know, it becomes decorative. And I think Sanford has consistently gone from 2 dimensions, 3, this form, inflatables, purposefully so that you could not get comfortable. And so I think that discomfort is where you...
Yeah, it's also a fugitivity in there. It's a rebellious spirit. It's the fact that we have always been told that we can't fit in, so why would I try to fit in?
Right.
I will make the language. People will come to it when they come to it, how they come to it,
Right.
whether I'm here or not.
Right.
That work is supposed to do that, and it's supposed to be interpreted and activated and charged by the people that come see it. So
That's right.
it is about the dialogue.
Yeah. All right.
Maybe one more, or we can leave it with that residue.
No, come. You can make it. We'll wait, right? Let's clap her up. You can
All
make
right.
it. You can make it. There you go. You can make it.
Okay. Hi, Sanford. I'm so happy that you're here and having this opportunity to hear you at Lea's Artist Talk series. We were both friends with Lea. I went to Spelman with Lea, and so we all go way back. And this is just such an amazing opportunity to hear the full history, because I will confess that when I saw some of your early work, well, I'll just say when I first was exposed to your work at the Studio Museum in Harlem when you were an artist in resident, I didn't get it. And Lea was always like, Sanford is amazing. I'm like, okay. But now I understand so much more. So this has been so amazing for me personally to hear it all come together. What is so amazing to me is you have absolutely no limits on the materials and the mediums that you do your art in. And how is it that, I guess I would say, what was the first medium you used? I guess we saw it early on. There were some sketches and there was some painting. But then when did you begin to break out and you have absolutely no limit in your materials and your mediums, if you will?
I mean, I think there was an attitude that I got from doing graffiti that was like, you know, just a middle finger up to any rules. So there was partly that. And also moving around from LA to Atlanta to Italy to Japan to all these places, I couldn't take all my materials with me. So I think as an artist or a creator, you always need to create. And if you don't have your typical tools, you find something else. So for me, it became more about what can I say with all these materials versus what can I do with just one? So I've been going through all this for years to try to, once again, I use language as a reference, to try to figure out a language that can traverse all these different formats. So when you read the statement or see the work or look at it years down the line, you start to make the through lines. And once again, not a straight line. This is something that you sort of have to bob and weave with. The work itself usually lends itself to several other layers of research and conversation that you can have with people around you, because everyone comes in from a different vantage point. And that's why I mentioned earlier that I think my work has never really been so much about just African Americana, but it's not about race, it's about culture. Mm-hmm. And culture comes from dialogue, interaction, and so on. And I want the work to be a catalyst to do that.
I think that's a really wonderful way of wrapping what has been a truly incredible night. I just want to thank Sanford and Derek so much again, and thank you for choosing to spend a portion of your week with us. If you enjoyed this program and want to ensure more like it happened, please consider donating to the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund. More information can be found on our website. And I think for those on Zoom, there will be a link in the chat. But with that, I just thank you so much. We have one more program on Thursday night. I hope you can attend that in person as well at Storefront for Art and Architecture. If not, till 2023, good night, stay well, good luck. Thank you. Thank you.
Good job, man.